There is an uncomfortable truth that most empaths are never told directly. If you are always the one who understands, the one who endures, the one who carries the weight, then it is very possible that you are not actually helping anyone. You are keeping dysfunctional systems alive. In families, your silence allows disorder to continue. In relationships, your patience shields manipulation. At work, your habit of trying just a little harder keeps toxic structures from collapsing. And you have called this love, responsibility, maturity. But recently, something inside you has begun to resist, not through anger, not through tears, but through a very dangerous realization. This endurance is no longer right. Carl Jung recognized this moment. Very early on, he did not see it as a crisis. He saw it as the breaking point of a role, the role of the absorber, the one who soothes, the one who keeps everything from falling apart. Jung called this the most dangerous transformation of the empath. Not dangerous for you, but dangerous for those who have grown accustomed to surviving by your disappearance. If you look closely, you will notice the world around you beginning to react. People who once leaned on you start to feel uneasy. Those who were used to your understanding begin to say, "You have changed." Relationships that once felt fine suddenly grow tense, simply because you no longer yield automatically. This is not random. This is a sign that an old survival mechanism is collapsing, and Jung discovered something that even caused him to pause. When an empath stops abandoning themselves, not everyone in their life remains as safe as before, because the part of you that is returning is not here to maintain the old order. It is here to end it. The truth is, this journey does not begin in adulthood. It begins very early. Jung observed that most empaths come from a similar background. A sensitive child entering an environment that is not safe enough to hold their true self. It does not have to be violence. Sometimes it is simply a family too consumed by their own pain, a mother locked in chronic anxiety, a father who is physically present but never truly listening, a system where strong emotions are treated as a nuisance. That child quickly learns an unspoken rule. To be loved, they must be less of themselves. Crying too much is called weakness. Anger is labeled disrespect. Having needs is seen as selfishness. And so, without anyone needing to teach them, the child begins to adjust. They learn to observe instead of express. They learn to read other people's emotions before opening their mouth. They learn how to become easy to be around. Jung called this structure the persona. But for the empath, the persona is not just a social mask. It becomes a survival system. You become the good child, the one who understands, the one who carries the emotional responsibility for the entire room. And little by little, the parts that do not fit that role are pushed into the shadow. Anger is buried. Resistance is labeled bad. Personal desires are treated as dangerous. Not because you do not have them, but because expressing them could cost you connection. And no one tells you that. The persona does not only protect you, it replaces you. And this is where everything begins to turn. Years pass, and that child grows into an adult, with an extraordinary ability to sense others. You walk into a room, and immediately know who is tense, who is lying, who is about to explode. You know what to say to soothe, when to stay silent to avoid conflict, how much more you need to carry so everything does not fall apart. But Jung recognized a chilling paradox. The more perfect the persona becomes, the more the true self is suffocated. You know what others need, before they are even aware of it themselves. But when you are asked what you need, you are empty. Not because you have no needs, but because you trained yourself not to listen to them. And now, the cost begins to be collected. Not just exhaustion, not just burnout, but loss of self. You no longer exist as a person, but as a function, an emotional absorption unit, a stabilizing system for others. a support everyone leans on and no one protects. And here is the most dangerous part. When you have no inner boundaries, you become a resource. Those who need healing are drawn to you. Those who refuse emotional responsibility attach themselves to you. Toxic systems keep you in place because you help them continue to function, not because you are weak, but because you are exceptionally good at enduring. Jung understood that the empath's persona, when it is not dismantled, does not only exhaust you, it makes you systematically exploitable. And at a certain point, the very thing that once helped you survive begins to threaten your own existence. You may not realize it yet, but a shift has already been activated. The persona is cracking, and when it breaks, no one in the old system remains safe, especially those who grew accustomed to using you without ever asking whether you were still there. There is a very specific moment that most empaths remember with exact clarity. Not the day you first became tired, not the moment you realized you were being taken advantage of, but the moment you stopped doubting your own perception. Jung recognized that the empath's awakening rarely comes from thought. It comes from impact. Most often, from betrayal, not the vague kind, but from the person you protected the longest, trusted the deepest, and constantly told yourself they didn't mean it. It may be a partner you sensed something was wrong with for years, but kept blaming yourself for being too sensitive. It may be a family member who turned away at the exact moment you needed them most. It may be a friend who used your understanding as entertainment behind your back. The common thread is not the behavior, it is the feeling. Empaths often told Jung the same sentence, despite never having met each other. I knew it for a long time, but I didn't want to believe it. You saw the signs, the small details that didn't line up, the words that made your chest tighten, the moments when intuition whispered and you immediately silenced it with logic. Not because you were foolish, but because believing the truth would force you to act, and action meant loss. But then, one day, the truth no longer allows you to look away. That moment, Jung called a clarity event. There is no drama, no shouting, no collapse. Instead, a strange stillness appears. You stop listening to explanations. You stop being pulled into emotion. You simply observe, as if you are watching a film you have seen hundreds of times, but for the first time, you understand the plot. Every argument suddenly has logic. Every apology reveals a pattern. Every time you are called too sensitive reveals itself as avoidance of responsibility. What makes this moment terrifying is not the truth about the other person. It is the truth about yourself. You realize that you have been betraying your own perception again and again to keep the relationship alive. You were not only being gaslit, you were participating in gaslighting yourself. And when that breaks open, the persona can no longer protect you. Jung observed that immediately after the clarity event, empaths often appear cold to others, not because they have lost their feelings, but because they stop allowing emotion to dictate behavior. They no longer apologize out of reflex. They no longer try to make everything okay. They no longer rush to rescue. Their silence causes those who are accustomed to living in gray zones to begin to panic because, for the first time, they are no longer shielded. And the empath, even if they cannot yet name what is happening, has crossed a boundary they cannot return from. The persona has cracked, and what is rising from underneath is not bitterness. It is irreversible clarity. From that moment on, every attempt to return to the old version of yourself fails, not because you do not want to, but because you have seen, and Jung understood this with absolute precision. Once an empath has seen the entire pattern, their old life has only two options left. Either the surrounding system must change, or they will leave it. After that moment of clarity, something begins to surface very quickly, not in you, but in the people around you. The atmosphere shifts before a single word is spoken. Conversations that once stretched on suddenly become short. Jokes that once forced a polite smile now fall into empty space. There are looks that linger longer than necessary. There are silences that appear the moment you enter the room. You do nothing at all, yet the old order begins to tremble. Jung recognized that when an empath stops absorbing, the system that once relied on them reacts like a body that has suddenly lost its regulatory organ. Those who were used to dumping their emotions onto you begin to feel exposed. Those you once protected begin to reveal their insecurity. Those who lived comfortably off your endurance are suddenly forced to face themselves. And the first reaction is rarely self-reflection. It is blame. You've changed lately. You've become cold. You're not like you used to be. Did someone influence you? These statements are not meant to understand you. They are meant to pull you back into your old position. Jung called this a system-preserving reflex, because if you change, every old role has to be rewritten. A family that once needed you as the peacemaker no longer knows who will keep the dinner table calm. A relationship that relied on your yielding now has to face boundaries. A workplace that exploited your devotion now encounters someone who is no longer willing to sacrifice in silence. You begin to notice very specific things. Messages become less frequent. Calls come only when the other person needs something. Whispers behind your back. Stories being distorted. Some people avoid you. Some attack you. Some play the victim because you no longer play the savior. This shocks the empath, not because of the pain, but because of the brutal clarity. You realize that many relationships only existed when you were not yourself, and Jung emphasized a difficult truth. When you stop betraying yourself, you become a threat to those who live off your sacrifice. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped doing what they expected. Your silence becomes heavy. Your clarity is labeled selfish. Your withdrawal is interpreted as betrayal. But beneath all of this, there is a very simple truth. You are no longer responsible for other people's emotions. And this is the critical moment. Jung observed that many empaths collapse at this stage, not because they are weak, but because they did not anticipate the social cost of becoming real, being misunderstood, being distanced, being labeled. But if you make it through this point, if you do not turn back, just to be accepted again, something else begins to form, not loudly, not dramatically. A new inner structure is being built. And from here on, the empath no longer merely recognizes. They begin to choose. Not everyone gets access. Not every relationship is worth keeping. Not every accusation deserves a response. Jung knew that. This is not a comfortable phase. But he also knew this is an indispensable point on the path back to yourself, because before a new self can be born, the old one will always try to pull you back at any cost. There is a major misunderstanding about this stage. Many people believe that when an empath changes, they become cold, bitter, or retaliatory. Jung observed the opposite. What happens is not that you gain more negative emotion, but that you are no longer afraid of emotions that were once forbidden. For many years, you were taught that anger is bad, that saying no is selfish, that disappointing others is wrong. As a result, every natural response to violation was pushed into the shadow, not eliminated, only suppressed, and Jung called that very storage space the shadow. When the persona begins to crack, the shadow can no longer be contained. It rises, not to destroy, but to restore balance. You begin to feel a very strange kind of energy, not explosive anger, but a sharp, lucid calm, an ability to look directly without needing to explain, a sense that you no longer have to prove that you are a good person. This is when the empath becomes a mirror, not in a moral sense, But in a psychological one, when someone brings manipulation, you no longer absorb it. You reflect it. When someone plants guilt, you no longer apologize by reflex. You allow them to face their own motives. When someone says one thing, but their behavior tells a different story, you no longer doubt your perception. You trust it. Jung recognized that at this stage, the empath does not become aggressive. They become dangerous to falsehood. Because for the first time, all the data you have collected over a lifetime is placed in its proper position. You clearly see who is avoiding responsibility, who is using emotion to control, who needs you weak so they can feel strong. And what terrifies others is not what you say. It is your refusal to be pulled in. No more endless arguments. No more long explanations. No more trying to make them understand. You observe. You register. And you withdraw your energy. This creates a very powerful effect. Those who are accustomed to living in gray zones feel exposed. Those who relied on your emotional reactions suddenly lose control. Those who believed you would always be there to absorb no longer have a point of support. Jung called this the mirror effect, not because you actively counterattack, but because you no longer shield. At this stage, your shadow is not cruelty. It is the ability not to participate, not rushing in to rescue, not carrying consequences for others, not turning yourself into an intermediary so others can avoid the truth. And here is the most important point. Shadow integration does not turn you into a bad person. It turns you into someone with full choice. You can speak, and you can also remain silent. You can stay, and you can also leave, without hatred. Jung warned that an empath who has not integrated their shadow will continue to be manipulated, no matter how intelligent they are. But an empath who has integrated their shadow becomes impossible to control, using the old tools, not because they are tougher, but because they no longer react automatically. And from this moment on, a deeper shift begins. No longer identification, no longer social reaction, but the construction of a new inner order, an order in which emotion no longer dominates behavior and compassion no longer means self-destruction. This is when the empath prepares to enter the phase Jung called ego restructuring, and it will change how you live, how you love, and how you move through this world. Once the shadow has been integrated, something very specific begins to happen. Not loudly, no declarations. No, I have awakened, yet the entire system around you begins to react. Jung recognized that when an empath enters this stage, the change is not in dramatic actions, but in the things they no longer do. You no longer take the initiative to smooth the atmosphere. You no longer fill silence with words. You no longer carry emotional responsibility for others. And it is precisely this absence that causes the old order to begin to shake. In families, conversations that once felt familiar suddenly become shorter. Statements you used to catch now land directly on the table. There are looks that linger longer than usual. There are silences no one wants to touch. There are whispers behind your back that you no longer feel the need to correct. At work, you are no longer the one who is always available. You hear the request, but you also hear the motive. You see the task, but you also see who is avoiding responsibility. You do not refuse harshly. You simply respond appropriately. And that causes those who were used to relying on your flexibility to feel disoriented. Jung called this ego restructuring, not because you are building a new ego, but because you are withdrawing energy from the false self that has been operating in your place for many years. The persona that once helped you survive now feels too tight. Each time you try to return to the old role, your body reacts immediately. A tightening in the chest, a very clear sense of wrongness, a quiet but decisive no from within. You can no longer pretend without paying a price. And this is the point where many empaths become confused. They think they are losing their empathy. In reality, they are stopping its diffusion. Your compassion does not disappear. It becomes directed, bounded, conditioned by clarity. You begin to choose who gets access to your energy and who is only allowed to observe from the outside, not because you are above anyone else, but because you understand that psychological resources are finite. Jung emphasized that this stage is easily misunderstood. From the outside, you appear to have changed. From the inside, you feel aligned for the first time. There is no longer a split between what you feel and what you do. No gap between intuition and action. You no longer need to think about how you should respond. The response comes naturally, without strain. And it is precisely this consistency that causes some people to pull back, not because you threaten them, but because you can no longer be used through the old mechanisms. Jung called this the withdrawal from unconscious agreements, agreements you never knowingly signed, yet were bound by. I will understand for you. I will endure for you. I will stay silent so everything can remain calm. Not anymore. You do not need to dismantle the system. You simply stop feeding it energy. And when that happens, the truth begins to surface in ways no one expects. Relationships without real foundations begin to loosen. Roles built on sacrifice begin to collapse. This is not your collapse. This is the collapse of structures that required you to stay weak. And from that cleared ground, a new question emerges. Not, who am I to them? But, who do I choose to be when I no longer have to strain just to survive? This question leads you into the next phase, a phase in which the empath does not merely stand firm, but begins to redefine how they exist in the world. Once the empath has withdrawn from the old unconscious agreements, another phase quietly begins to appear, quieter, more dangerous. Jung warned that, after an individual separates from the old system, the greatest threat no longer comes from others. It comes from your own new perception. You begin to see everything too clearly. The motives hidden behind polite words, power games disguised as concern, family structures, organizations, relationships, built not on maturity, but on avoidance of responsibility. You see it so quickly that sometimes even you are startled by it. And along with that clarity, another feeling emerges. Isolation. Not because no one is around you, but because you encounter fewer and fewer people operating at the same level of awareness. You begin to feel as though you are the only person in the room, tuned to a different frequency. Conversations grow shallow. Stories repeat. Reactions become so familiar, you can predict every step in advance. Jung called this the danger of perception without integration. Heightened awareness that is not anchored by humility and inner discipline leads to a new trap. Ego inflation. You begin to think, I see more clearly than they do. Again, I understand more deeply than they do. I am awake, and they are not. And that is a very fragile moment. Because if you take one more step in that direction, you are not very different from the old system at all. You have simply changed roles. From being the one exploited to becoming the one who stands outside and judges. Jung emphasized that individuation is never synonymous with superiority. If you feel above others, that is a sign you are out of balance. An integrated empath does not look down on others. They look across, but with very clear boundaries. They do not need to prove that they see more. They also do not need to awaken others, because they understand something essential. Consciousness cannot be forced. And this is the pivotal shift. Instead of withdrawing completely from the world, the mature empath learns how to participate selectively. They do not hide in isolation. They also do not dissolve back into the collective. They stand in between. They enter shared space without losing themselves. They listen without absorbing. They feel without carrying it for others. Jung called this conscious participation. You no longer need to perform a role, but you also do not need to expose everything. Your silence is no longer avoidance. It is choice. Your voice is no longer reaction. It is intentional action. And this completely changes how others experience you. Those who once manipulated begin to find you hard to access. Those accustomed to using emotion to control feel that you have become cold. Meanwhile, those who are psychologically mature begin to approach you in a very different way. Not to be rescued, but to engage in dialogue, not to unload, but to share responsibility. At this stage, the empath is no longer a shelter for chaos. They become an anchor, not because they speak loudly, but because they stand firm. And from that steadiness, a new role begins to take shape, not the emotional caretaker, not the unconditional healer, but someone who can face the truth directly without destroying anyone, including themselves. That role will be tested very clearly in the next phase, when the empath is no longer just required to hold boundaries, but must decide how they will lead in a world still filled with unconsciousness. When the empath has learned how to be present without dissolving, a very real shift begins to take place in everyday life. Not loudly, no declarations, but enough for every old system to start reacting. You are no longer the one who is always available, no longer the place where people unload their emotions and walk away relieved, no longer the one who automatically assumes responsibility for problems that were never yours. And it is precisely this withdrawal that exposes what was previously hidden. Jung noted that when an empath stops playing the role of system stabilizer, the system begins to wobble. Families grow more tense. Workplaces reveal deeper conflicts. Relationships that once seemed fine begin to show their misalignment. Not because you did something wrong, but because you are no longer shielding others. You begin to see very clearly who only reaches out when they need something, who is only kind when you are easy to control, who calls it love, when in reality it is unlimited access. And this is when many empaths begin to be labeled. You are told you have changed, that you are cold, selfish, not like you used to be. Jung did not see this as failure. He saw it as a precise marker of the individuation process. Because every system reacts when one element refuses to continue its old role. The danger at this stage is not being misunderstood. It is being pulled back through guilt. Familiar phrases begin to surface. You weren't like this before. You're making things complicated. It's just helping a little more. If the empath is not yet stable enough, they will return to the old role, simply to avoid this discomfort. But the mature empath is different. They feel the guilt, but no longer allow it to govern their behavior. They understand that other people's discomfort is no longer the measure of their moral worth. Jung called this the formation of inner authority, not authority imposed on others, but authority that requires no justification. You do not need to explain why you leave. You do not need to convince anyone to understand. You do not need to prove that you are right. Your clarity is the answer in itself. And here is a subtle but profound shift. You begin to choose where your sensitivity goes. Before, you felt everything. Now you still feel, but you no longer open the door to everyone. You no longer pour your heart into people who only know how to take and never take responsibility. You no longer try to heal those who have never wanted to face themselves. Your empathy becomes strategic, not out of calculation, but out of self-respect. Jung emphasized that compassion without boundaries is not virtue, but a form of self-destruction. The integrated empath understands that every time you say yes to the wrong person, you are saying no to yourself. And when you stop doing that, something very strange happens. Manipulative people begin to avoid you. No arguments, no confrontations. They simply disappear. Meanwhile, new relationships begin to appear, not loud, not entangled, but reciprocal. For the first time, you are not the one holding the emotional rhythm for the entire room. You can be tired without apologizing. You can say no without explaining. You can leave without feeling like a bad person. And within that freedom, the empath begins to touch a much larger question. If I am no longer living to stabilize old systems, what will I use this sensitivity for next? That question leads directly into the next stage. A stage where the empath does not merely protect themselves, but begins to establish their true role in the world. When the empath is no longer being pulled back into old roles, a new danger appears, not from the outside, but from the clarity they have just gained. Jung warned very clearly about this stage. He called it the danger of consciousness outrunning character. You begin to see too much. You see the motives behind polite words, the defenses behind smiles, the fear behind control, the power games hidden inside seemingly harmless interactions. And gradually, you begin to feel like the only awake person in the room. This is when many empaths withdraw completely. They choose silence. They choose isolation. They choose to stand outside all relationships, because no one is truly clean. But Jung was very clear. Isolation is not integration. Isolation is only a more refined defense. If you use awareness to avoid humanity altogether, you fall into another form of imbalance, one that Jung called spiritual ego inflation. You don't say it out loud, but inside there is a quiet whisper. I see more than they do. I understand more deeply than they do. They are too unconscious to reach me. This voice is dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it turns your capacity into a tool for separation. Instead of conscious connection, an integrated empath does not stand above others. They stand firmly within themselves. The difference is subtle. You do not need to prove that you see through things. You also do not need to withdraw. You learn how to participate selectively. Jung called this stage conscious participation. You are still in society, still working, still loving, but you do not dissolve. You can sit in a room full of tension without becoming the absorber. You can listen to another person's pain without carrying it home. You can see manipulation without exposing or lecturing. You choose when to open and when to close. This is when the empath begins to understand that their capacity was never meant to save everyone. It was meant to orient, not through advice, not through moralizing, but through clear presence. You do not need to say much. You only need to remain aligned with the truth inside yourself, and this creates a powerful influence. Those who are accustomed to manipulation feel uncomfortable around you, not because you attack, but because you no longer react as before. No more soothing, no more explaining, no more carrying emotions for others. Meanwhile, those with a similar level of awareness begin to find you, not through drama, but through a sense of safety. For the first time, you do not have to do anything to be respected. Respect comes from your refusal to betray yourself. Jung saw this as a sign of a personality that has crossed a threshold of maturity. Someone who can feel deeply without being swept away, who can see clearly without becoming bitter, and most importantly, someone who can be among people without losing themselves. This is when the empath begins to understand that their true role is neither sacrifice nor separation, but to serve as an anchor for truth in a world accustomed to living through avoidance. And from this point, a larger question emerges. When you no longer use your capacity to endure, and you also no longer use it to withdraw, how will you lead? That question opens the final chapter of this journey. This journey was never about becoming better. Jung did not call this improvement. He called it a return to the self you had to abandon in order to survive environments that were not safe enough for truth. You once believed that if you felt less, you would hurt less. But the truth is, you were never born to shut down your capacity to feel. You were born to carry it within a structure strong enough to hold it. When an empath learns this, they are no longer a place where the world dumps its emotional waste. They become a place where truth is reflected back, not through accusation, but through boundaries, not through anger, but through clarity that cannot be shaken. You no longer need to prove that you have changed. The change is revealed in what you no longer do. You no longer over-explain. You no longer stay where you are shrinking. You no longer try to save those who do not want to awaken. And most importantly, you no longer ask permission to be yourself. Jung believed that an integrated empath is not someone who abandons the world. They are someone who remains without being swallowed by it. They live among people without losing their soul. They love without turning themselves into a sacrifice. If you are at this stage where old roles are falling away, old relationships no longer fit, and the truth inside you has become too clear to ignore, remember this: you are not losing yourself. You are reclaiming yourself. And once you have crossed this threshold, there is no way back. There is only one path forward: to live as a whole human being, to feel deeply without being destroyed by that very capacity. That is not the end. That is the true beginning.